Prepare for a story that shows how grief can make a person vulnerable, but also incredibly strong. At my wife's funeral, as I stood by her casket, I overheard my son whisper to his wife, "Now we just have to handle the old man." They thought they saw a broken, grieving old man. They didn't see a soldier preparing for his last battle. A huge hello to all of my dear friends. And today's special hello goes out to Dwayne from New York, Kendi from Scotland, and Keisha from Nigeria. Thank you for being with me. We would love to know from what corners of the world you're watching. Please let us know your city in the comments below. And now make yourselves comfortable. My name is Samuel, and I am 64 years old. The scent of roses, my wife's favorite flower, was so thick and cloying in the funeral home that it was difficult to breathe. Roses were supposed to smell of love, of life, of the beautiful, chaotic garden she had so carefully tended for 40 years in the backyard of our Birmingham home. But today, mingled with the funereal scent of lilies and the quiet, pervasive odor of grief, they smelled only of her absence. My rose was gone. And as I stood by her open casket, the pain of that simple, brutal fact was a physical weight, a crushing pressure on my chest that was almost impossible to bear. I had spent 20 years as an Army medic. I have seen the fragility of the human body in the most horrific of circumstances. I have held the hands of dying soldiers. I have knelt in the mud and the blood, and I have learned to compartmentalize, to build a wall of professional calm around my own heart. It's a skill you learn to survive. You focus on the task at hand, the wound to be dressed, the tourniquet to be tightened, the words of comfort to be offered. You build a fortress inside your mind, and you do not allow the chaos outside its walls to breach your defenses. But this was different. This was not a soldier struck down by the random cruelty of war. This was my Rose, the woman who had been the quiet, steady rhythm of my entire adult life, taken from me by the slow, merciless siege of cancer. And as I looked at her, so still and peaceful in the polished mahogany box, the walls I had spent a lifetime building came crumbling down. My medic's training was useless here. There was no wound to dress, no bleeding to stop. There was only the gaping internal hemorrhage of a heart that had been torn in two. I felt like a broken, grieving old man, lost and adrift in a sea of sorrow. And it was in that moment of my greatest vulnerability, as I stood guard over the body of my wife, that the second, and in many ways crueler, blow was struck. My son, Junior, and his wife, Alicia, were standing just a few feet away, ostensibly paying their respects. They moved through the somber room with the practiced, theatrical grief of people performing a role. Alicia, in a stylish and clearly very expensive black coat, would occasionally dab at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Junior, my son, just looked lost, his gaze unfocused, his movement stiff and awkward. They thought my own profound grief had rendered me deaf and blind to the world around me. They were wrong. Even in my sorrow, the old soldier in me, the man trained to be acutely aware of his surroundings, was still on duty. I heard them, their voices low, conspiratorial whispers that they thought were masked by the sad ambient organ music. They were a profound and shocking violation of the sacred silence of the room. "Look at him," Alicia whispered, and her voice, though quiet, was as sharp and as cold as a shard of glass. "He's completely lost without her. A good medic is always aware of everything in his operational theater. And my senses, honed by years of needing to hear the quietest whisper of pain on a chaotic battlefield, were preternaturally sharp. While I was accepting a tearful hug from Rose's sister, I was also listening. And what I heard in the sacred grieving air of the cemetery was the cold, hard language of commerce. "The market is at its peak right now, Junior," Alicia said, her voice a low, urgent hiss. She made a show of pulling her expensive black coat tighter around herself, as if the warm, sunny day were a bitter chill. An inspector I know said that with a lot this size, in a neighborhood this established, a developer would pay a fortune. They'd tear down the old house, of course, subdivide the lot, and probably put up 2 or 3 of those modern monstrosities. I felt a fresh wave of rage, so potent it was almost a physical nausea. The old house she spoke of was the one I had built with my own 2 hands, the home where we had brought our son home from the hospital, the place where my wife's spirit still lived in every room, in every scuff on the hardwood floor, in every rose bush in the garden. And to them, it was just a lot, a tear down, an asset to be liquidated. My son, my junior, at least had the decency to sound conflicted, though his protest was as weak and as watery as his character. "Alicia, I don't know," he'd murmured, his voice low. "It feels fast. We just buried her." "Don't be sentimental, Junior," she'd snapped, her voice cutting and impatient. "Sentimentality is a luxury we can't afford. This is business." "Besides," she added, her voice dropping to a confidential, pitying tone, "look at him. He's falling apart. He won't last long on his own. He'll probably fall down the stairs or forget to turn the stove off within a month." She paused and then delivered the line that was the final, damning piece of her monstrous logic. "A problem to be handled, a logistical loose end to be tied up so they could get to the real prize. The house, the property, the assets I had spent a lifetime accumulating. In the deepest, most profound moment of my sorrow, they were not seeing my pain. They were seeing an opportunity. A wave of pure white-hot rage, a feeling I had not experienced since my days in the service, surged through me. My first instinct was to turn, to confront them, to unleash the full, terrible force of my fury upon them in this quiet, respectable room. But then another instinct, an older and more disciplined one, took over. The medic's calm, the soldier's strategy. You do not engage the enemy on their terms. You do not reveal your position until you have a clear and decisive advantage. I did not move. I did not turn. I did not let a single flicker of the rage that was burning inside me cross my face. I just stood there, my hand resting on the cool, smooth wood of Rose's casket, and I let their poison wash over me. They saw a broken, grieving old man, an easy target for their manipulations. They did not see the soldier who had just been handed a new, final, and deeply personal mission. They did not see the man who had just silently declared a new war. The funeral was no longer just a farewell to my wife. It was now a reconnaissance mission on the 2 people who were about to become my sworn enemies. The rest of the funeral service passed in a surreal, muffled haze. I remember the sad, kind face of our pastor, his words about Rose's kindness and her unshakable faith washing over me without truly penetrating the cold, hard shell that was forming around my heart. I remember the procession of friends and neighbors, their hands on my shoulder, their voices thick with a genuine shared sorrow. I nodded. I accepted their condolences. I played the part of the grieving widower, all while a separate, colder part of my mind, The medic, the soldier, was already assessing the new reality of my situation. The primary threat was no longer the cancer that had taken my wife. The primary threat was in a room with me, wearing a black suit and a look of practiced filial grief. The graveside service was a final, brutal assault on my already shattered heart. We stood on a gentle green hill in the Birmingham cemetery, under the shade of an ancient oak tree, a place Rose and I had chosen together years ago. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. As the pastor spoke his final words and the casket was prepared to be lowered into the earth, I felt a grief so profound, so absolute, that it threatened to pull me down into the grave with her. This was it, the final physical act of separation. 40 years of shared life, of laughter and arguments, of raising a child and growing old together, all of it now reduced to a polished wooden box and a 6-foot hole in the red Alabama clay. As the small crowd of mourners began to disperse, each one stopping to give me a final hug or a squeeze of the arm, I kept my son and his wife in my peripheral vision. They had moved a short distance away, standing near the edge of our family plot, believing themselves to be in a private, confidential space. They were wrong. A good medic is always aware of everything in his operational theater, and my senses, honed by years of needing to hear the quietest whisper of pain on a chaotic battlefield, were preternaturally sharp. While I was accepting a tearful hug from Rose's sister, I was also listening, and what I heard in the sacred grieving air of the cemetery was the cold, hard language of commerce. "The market is at its peak right now, Junior," Alicia said, her voice a low, urgent hiss. She made a show of pulling her expensive black coat tighter around herself, as if the warm, sunny day were a bitter chill. An inspector I know said that with a lot this size, in a neighborhood this established, a developer would pay a fortune. They'd tear down the old house, of course, subdivide the lot, and probably put up 2 or 3 of those modern monstrosities. I felt a fresh wave of rage, so potent it was almost a physical nausea. The old house she spoke of was the one I had built with my own 2 hands. The home where we had brought our son home from the hospital. The place where my wife's spirit still lived in every room, in every scuff on the hardwood floor, in every rose bush in the garden. And to them, it was just a lot, a tear down, an asset to be liquidated. My son, my junior, at least had the decency to sound conflicted, though his protest was as weak and as watery as his character. "Alicia, I don't know," he'd murmured, his voice low. "It feels fast. We just buried her." "Don't be sentimental, Junior," she'd snapped, her voice cutting and impatient. "Sentimentality is a luxury we can't afford. This is business. Besides," she added, her voice dropping to a confidential, pitying tone, "look at him. He's falling apart. He won't last long on his own. He'll probably fall down the stairs or forget to turn the stove off within a month." She paused and then delivered the line that was the final, damning piece of her monstrous logic. "Moving him into a nice, clean, professional assisted living facility. We'll be doing him a favor. He'll be safer there, and we'll be free to manage the estate properly." A favor. They were going to do me a favor by ripping me from my home, from the last tangible connection I had to my wife, and placing me in a sterile, anonymous room to wait out my final days, all so they could cash in on the real estate. In that moment, standing by my wife's open grave, I understood everything. A direct confrontation would be a fool's errand. They would deny everything. They would twist my grief, my anger, into evidence of my own confusion, my own mental decline. They would use my own pain as the weapon to prove their case, to show the world that the poor, sad old man was no longer competent to make his own decisions. I could not fight them on that battlefield. I would lose. The soldier in me, the strategist, took full and complete command. I had to fight this war on a different front, not with the loud, messy weapons of emotion, but with the quiet, precise, and devastatingly effective weapons of strategy, of law, of the unexpected silent maneuver. I turned from Rose's sister, my face a mask of pure, heartbreaking grief that was now, in a strange way, entirely genuine. I was not just mourning my wife. I was mourning my son and the hollowed out, empty shell of a man he had become. I walked slowly, deliberately, over to where they were standing, their ghoulish conversation coming to an abrupt halt as I approached. I looked at my son, and with all the sincerity I could muster, I placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Junior," I said, my voice thick with a sorrow that was both real and a performance. "After everyone is gone, I need you and Alicia to come back to the house. We need to have a family dinner, just like old times. We need to be together." I saw the look that passed between them, a quick, triumphant, and predatory glance. The poor, broken old man was already turning to them for support. He was already walking into their trap. "Of course, Dad," Junior said, his voice full of a false, dutiful concern. "We'll be there." As I walked away from my wife's grave, leaving them to their quiet, ghoulish plotting, I did not look back. I was a commander, leaving a compromised position and retreating to a defensible location to formulate my counterattack. I already knew the first phone call I would make when I got back to the house. It would be to my lawyer. The battle for Rose's legacy had officially begun. The drive home from the cemetery was a silent, solitary journey through a city that seemed both achingly familiar and terrifyingly alien. Every street corner, every landmark held a ghost of a memory with Rose. There was a small diner where we'd had our first date, the park where we'd pushed Junior on the swings, the movie theater where we'd seen our first film together. For 40 years, this city had been the map of our shared life. Now, it was just a landscape of loss. When I arrived back at the house, the quiet was a physical presence. The scent of the funeral flowers was a sweet, suffocating cloud that seemed to cling to the very air. The house was no longer a home. It was a mausoleum, a monument to a life that was now over. I walked through the silent rooms, my hand trailing along the back of her favorite armchair, my gaze falling upon the small, half-finished knitting project she had left in a basket by the fireplace. The evidence of her was everywhere, and the absence of her was a wound that would never close. I found myself, as I so often did, drawn to her garden. It was her sanctuary, the small patch of Alabama earth she had transformed into a riot of color and life. It was the one place where I still felt her presence most keenly. As I stood on the back patio, the warm afternoon sun on my face, my mind drifted away from the ugly, grasping greed I had witnessed at her graveside. It drifted back 3 months to another sunny afternoon in this very garden, one of the last good days we'd had together. The cancer had already taken her strength by then, but it had not touched her spirit. She was sitting in a comfortable wicker chair, a thick, soft blanket over her lap, her face pale, but her eyes as clear and as sharp as ever. I was kneeling in the dirt beside her, carefully tending to her beloved rose bushes, the ones that now stood as silent, beautiful sentinels over her memory. "They're beautiful this year, Sammy," she'd said, her voice a soft, papery whisper, but still full of the warmth that had been my anchor for 4 decades. "You have a good hand with them." "I had a good teacher," I'd replied, my own voice thick with an emotion I tried to hide. We sat in a comfortable silence for a while, just listening to the buzz of the bees and the rustle of the wind in the great oak tree. We both knew our time together was short, and it had made us cherish these small, quiet moments of peace. "You know," she'd said finally, her gaze distant, "I've been thinking a lot about the boy." She always called him the boy, even though Junior was now a man in his 40s. "He's a good man deep down, Sammy, but he doesn't have your spine. He has my soft heart, and that wife of his, she knows how to play on it. She's not a bad person," she'd added, her generosity of spirit still intact even at the end. "She's just hungry, and she is teaching our son her same kind of hunger." I had just nodded, my hands still in the soil. It was a truth we both knew, but rarely spoke aloud. "This house," she'd continued, her gaze sweeping over the home we had built together, the garden she had nurtured from nothing. "This garden, it's our story, isn't it? It's the only real, tangible thing we ever truly built. It's made of more than just wood and nails, Sammy. It's made of our laughter and our tears and 40 years of our love." She turned to me then, her eyes full of a fierce, protective light. "Don't let them turn our story into a commodity. Don't let them sell it for a bigger car or a fancier vacation. This place is sacred." I had promised her I would protect it. Later that afternoon, as we sat together, she spoke of the people from the local Cancer Support Foundation, the hospice volunteers, the nurses, the grief counselors. "They were angels, Sammy," she'd whispered, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. "Strangers who treated me with such dignity, who held my hand, who made the end of this journey peaceful. I wish there was a way to pay back that kind of kindness." Now, standing alone in that same garden, the scent of her roses a sweet, painful ghost in the air, her words returned to me not as a memory, but as a directive, a final, sacred mission from my commanding officer. "Don't let them sell our story. Find a way to honor the kindness." The path forward, which had been a confusing, grief-stricken fog just hours before, was now brilliantly, perfectly clear. My son and his wife's ugly, grasping greed was not a new problem to be solved. It was an old problem for which my wife, in her final, gentle wisdom, had already given me the solution. Donating our home to the very kind of foundation that had helped her in her final days was not an act of revenge against my son. It was the perfect, beautiful, and most profound fulfillment of my wife's final wish. It would protect our home, our legacy, forever. And it would transform our private sanctuary of love into a public sanctuary of peace and support for others, paying back the debt of kindness we owed. The grief in my heart was still a vast and terrible thing. But now it was no longer just a weight. It was a fuel. It was a purpose. I turned from the garden, from the silent, beautiful company of my wife's roses, and I walked back into the house. I went directly to my study, the room where I kept my files, my records, my entire life, organized with a soldier's precision. I picked up the phone, I did not call my son. I did not call a friend. I called my lawyer. I stood up from the garden bench, the memory of Rose's voice, her final sacred request, a clear and ringing mandate in my soul. The grief had not lessened, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a paralyzing, anchorless sorrow. It was now a focused, purposeful energy, a fuel for the mission she had given me. I walked back into the quiet, lonely house, but I did not feel lonely anymore. I was a man with a purpose, a soldier with his final orders, and I felt my wife's presence beside me, a steady guiding hand on my shoulder. I went to my study and sat down at the heavy oak desk that had been my father's before it was mine. I picked up the phone. My hand was steady. My mind was clear. I dialed the number for Jonathan Davies, the man who had been my lawyer and my friend for over 30 years. His secretary answered, her voice full of a practiced, gentle sympathy. Mr. Davis's office. It's Samuel Washington, I said. I need to speak with him. This is a physician's affidavit, signed and notarized by my personal doctor, Dr. Evans, also dated from 2 days ago. It attests, in no uncertain terms, to my perfect mental and cognitive competence to make my own legal and financial decisions. I let that sink in before delivering the final, crushing blow. And this, I said, pointing to a specific, highlighted clause on the deed of gift, is the part you might find most interesting. It's a legal instrument known as a retained life estate. I looked directly at Alicia, the woman who had so confidently planned to redevelop my property. What that means, my dear, is that while the foundation is now the legal and irrevocable owner of this house, I, as the donor, retain the legally protected, absolute and unchallengeable right to live in and use this property without interference for the remainder of my natural life. So you see, I said, my voice a soft, final and devastating conclusion. I am not going anywhere. But more importantly, the house is no longer mine to sell, or for you to sell. It is and will forever be untouchable. The checkmate was absolute. I built an ironclad, legal fortress around my wife's legacy, and they were left standing outside the walls, disarmed, defeated, and utterly, completely powerless. Alicia was rigid with a silent, impotent fury, her dreams of new construction and a bigger car turning to dust before her very eyes. And Junior, my son, finally put his head in his hands, a single broken sob escaping his lips, the sound of a weak man finally being crushed under the full, unbearable weight of his own greed. I stood up from the table, my duty to my wife, to my home, and to my own dignity, finally, blessedly complete. Now, if you'll excuse me, I said, my voice no longer holding any trace of anger or even of sorrow. I have roses to tend to. I did not wait to watch the full spectacle of their defeat. I did not need to. I recounted the events of the funeral, the whispers I had overheard by the casket, the ghoulish, real estate-focused conversation I had witnessed at my own wife's graveside. I did so with a soldier's precision, stating the facts without the messy, emotional embroidery of my own rage and heartbreak. I was giving him a field report, an assessment of the enemy's position and intent. When I finished, Jonathan was silent for a long moment, a look of profound, angry disbelief on his face. The vultures, he finally whispered, shaking his head. To do that at her own funeral. Sam, I am so sorry. He leaned forward, his expression shifting from one of sympathy to one of a focused legal strategist. So, what do you want to do? We can fortify the will, add codicils, But if they try to have you declared incompetent, it could get ugly and expensive. I have a better idea, I said, and I laid out the plan that had come to me in the garden. The plan that was a perfect, beautiful synthesis of Rose's two final wishes. I want to donate the house, Jonathan. I want to give it lock, stock, and barrel to the Birmingham Cancer Support Foundation. But, I added, holding his gaze, I need to be able to live there for the rest of my life. I made a promise to Rose that I would not be driven from our home, and I will not break that promise. A slow, brilliant smile of understanding and admiration spread across Jonathan's face. Sam, you old dog, he said with a low chuckle, that's not just a good idea. That is a work of legal art. What you are describing is called a deed of gift with a retained life estate. He leaned back in his chair, warming to the subject, a lawyer in love with the beautiful, elegant machinery of the law. It's a powerful and ironclad legal instrument, Sam, he explained. We draft a deed that immediately transfers the ownership of the property to the foundation. They become the legal owners right away. The gift is profound, and it is irrevocable. But within that same deed, we include a clause that retains for you, the donor, a life estate. That gives you the legally protected, absolute, and undeniable right to live in, use, and enjoy the property without interference until the day you die. He leaned forward again, his eyes gleaming. They cannot sell it. They cannot mortgage it. And they absolutely, positively cannot evict you. You would be, for all intents and purposes, a lifelong rent-free tenant in a home that you no longer own. It is untouchable. When Junior and Alicia come to you with their sad little plan to put you in a home, they will discover that you have no home to give them. It will already belong to the charity. The beauty and the perfect strategic elegance of it was everything I could have hoped for. It was a move that was simultaneously an act of profound generosity and an act of absolute devastating warfare. Jonathan drafted the deed of gift that very morning. He called the director of the foundation, an organization he had a long-standing relationship with, and explained the situation. They were, of course, stunned, humbled, and deeply, profoundly grateful. They even agreed, at my request, that upon my passing, the house would not be sold, but would be maintained as Rose's house, a peaceful, comfortable, and free place of respite for the families of out-of-town cancer patients. That afternoon, I sat at a long, polished mahogany table in Jonathan's conference room. The legal documents spread out before me. I picked up the heavy, expensive pen. This was the point of no return. My signature on this document was a final goodbye to my son, a declaration of a war he did not even know I was fighting. As I lowered the pen to the paper, I whispered a silent message to my wife. I'm keeping my promise, Rosie. I'm protecting our story. I signed my name, my hand as steady as a surgeon's. I walked out of that law office and into the bright Birmingham sun, feeling lighter than I had in years. The deed was done. The legal trap was set. I was no longer a grieving husband, an asset to be managed. I was Samuel Washington, the lifelong protected tenant of Rose's house. And I was ready for dinner. The days following my meeting with the lawyer were a study in quiet transformation. The heavy, suffocating blanket of grief was still there, but it was no longer the only thing. Beneath it, a new and powerful feeling was taking root, a profound sense of purpose, a cold, clear, and utterly unshakable resolve. I was no longer just a man mourning his past. I was a man actively, strategically, and secretly shaping his future. The soldier, who had been in quiet retirement for so long, was now fully in command. I began to prepare my home, not as a grieving husband, but as a soldier preparing his dress uniform for a final, formal inspection. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, not with the aimless, sorrowful movements of the past week, but with a focused, meticulous energy. Every surface was dusted, every floor was polished, every window was washed until it gleamed. I was not just cleaning a house, I was setting a stage. I was preparing the battlefield for the final, decisive engagement. My primary focus was Rose's garden. It was the living, breathing heart of our home, and in the week since her passing, it had already begun to show the first signs of neglect. I spent hours under the warm Alabama sun, my hands in the rich, dark soil she had so lovingly cultivated. I pruned the rose bushes, their thorns a familiar, welcome pain against my worn hands. I weeded the flower beds. I watered the thirsty hydrangeas. With every weed I pulled, I felt like I was pulling a small piece of the ugliness of my son's betrayal from my own heart. I was restoring order, not just to the garden, but to my own soul. I was the custodian of her legacy, and I would not allow it to be overgrown with the weeds of their greed. I waited 4 days after the funeral before I made the call. It was a calculated delay, enough time for a grieving man to have wallowed in his sorrow, enough time for him to begin to feel the sharp, terrifying edges of his own loneliness. When I dialed my son's number on Wednesday evening, I deliberately allowed a slight, convincing tremor to enter my voice. "Junior son," I said, my voice a gravelly, heartbroken thing. "It's Dad." "Dad," he answered, his own voice a mixture of feigned concern and a poorly concealed impatience. "How are you holding up?" I'm managing," I lied, letting out a long, weary sigh that I knew would be music to his ears. It's just so quiet here, son. So empty. The house is too big for one person. I find myself just rattling around in it." I paused, letting him absorb the image of the sad, lonely old man I was painting for him. "I was hoping. I know you and Alicia are busy, but I was hoping maybe you two could come over for dinner on Saturday. Just like old times. I really, really don't want to be alone this weekend." I heard a muted sound on the other end of the line, the sound of him covering the receiver with his hand to whisper excitedly to his wife. Then he was back, his voice now a smooth, oily balm of filial duty. "Of course, Dad. Of course we'll be there. We wouldn't have you be alone. You just rest up. Don't you worry about a thing. We'll come over Saturday and we can talk. Talk about the future and how we can best help you." The trap was set. They had taken the bait with a hungry, predictable greed. They believed they were accepting an invitation from a weak, broken old man who was finally ready to be handled. They had no idea they were accepting a formal summons to their own judgment day. On the Saturday of the dinner, I continued my performance. I spent the day cooking one of Rose's favorite and most elaborate recipes, a slow-braised short rib stew that filled the entire house with a rich, welcoming aroma. The act of cooking her food, of using her pots and her spices for this specific, terrible purpose, felt like a strange kind of sacrilege, but I knew she would have understood. I was using a meal that had always been a symbol of our family's love as the final lure in a trap designed to save our family's honor. I set the dining room table with the good china, the pieces we only used for Christmas and anniversaries. I polished the silver. I lit the candles. The scene was a perfect, beautiful imitation of a happy family dinner. And on the antique sideboard against the wall, I placed a single, thin, and unassuming manila folder. I was sitting in the living room, a book open, but unread in my lap, when I saw their car pull into the driveway. They walked to the front door, and I saw that Alicia was carrying a handsome, professional-looking leather briefcase. They were not coming for dinner. They were coming for a closing. They had brought the papers with them, the documents that would be the instruments of my dispossession. The sheer audacious arrogance of it was breathtaking. I opened the door, my face a mask of sad, grateful relief. "I'm so glad you could make it," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "We wouldn't miss it for the world, Dad," Junior said, stepping inside. They walked into my home, my wife's home, a home that was now a fortress, believing they were the conquering army. They had no idea they were just two very foolish, very greedy prisoners of war, marching willingly and happily into their own final, inescapable defeat. I served the stew in Rose's favorite porcelain bowls, the ones with the delicate hand-painted blue flowers around the rim. The dining room was filled with the rich, comforting aroma of the meal, a scent that for 40 years had been synonymous with family, with love, with home. Tonight, it was a backdrop for a quiet, brutal ambush. Junior and Alicia were, as I had expected, masters of the performative compliment. "Dad, this is absolutely delicious," Junior exclaimed, his enthusiasm a little too loud, a little too forced. "I had no idea you had it in you. Truly, it's wonderful." "He's right, Samuel," Alicia chimed in, her smile a bright, predatory thing. "You're a man of hidden talents." I just nodded, accepting their empty praise with a humble, grateful expression that I hoped was convincing. "Your mother taught me a few things over the years," I said, my voice a quiet, mournful thing. I was playing the part of the broken, grieving widower to perfection. Throughout the meal, they skillfully and relentlessly laid the groundwork for their attack. Every word, a carefully placed brick in the wall of their argument. They spoke of the quietness of the house, of the draft from the old windows, of the way the stairs creaked at night. They framed these familiar, comforting sounds of an old house as threats, as dangers for a man all alone. "I was just so worried about you all week, Dad," Junior said, his brow furrowed with a look of deep, counterfeit concern. "Thinking of you here, in this big old place, all by yourself. What if you were to fall? Who would know? And the upkeep, Samuel," Alicia added, shaking her head with a look of profound, worldly weariness. "The garden, the gutters, the property taxes. It's a full-time job for a young man, let alone for someone in your position. It's simply too much to manage." They were so practiced, so perfectly in sync. It was like watching a pair of veteran actors perform a scene they had rehearsed 100 times. They were building a case, brick by brick, for my own incompetence, for my own obsolescence. And I, their star witness, just nodded along, providing them with the responses they needed. "Yes, you're right. The stairs are a bit steep. Yes, the garden has been a real challenge since Rose has been gone." I was giving them everything they wanted, lulling them into a state of absolute, confident victory. After the dinner plates were cleared, Alicia decided it was time for the final act. She looked at Junior and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Samuel," she began, her voice taking on a new, serious tone, the tone of a doctor about to deliver a difficult but necessary diagnosis. Since we're all here together and we're talking about the future, there is something we'd like to discuss with you. Something we've been thinking about a lot because we love you and we are so worried. She reached down beside her chair and placed her expensive black leather briefcase on the table. The sound of the latches clicking open was sharp and loud in the quiet room. It was a sound of grim final business. She pulled out a glossy tri-fold brochure and slid it across the polished wood towards me. The cover showed a group of silver-haired, impeccably dressed seniors laughing as they played a game of shuffleboard on a perfect green lawn. The name of the facility was printed in a cheerful, elegant script: Sunny Meadows Retirement Community. "We found a wonderful place, Dad," Junior said, his voice a soft, gentle caress. "It's the best in the state. They have a golf course, a swimming pool, a social club. You'd have friends. You'd be safe. There are nurses on call 24/7. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. We just want you to be comfortable and happy in your golden years," Alicia added, her voice a purr of sweet reason, "not rattling around in this big, empty, and frankly unsafe house. We would be able to visit you all the time, and our minds would finally be at ease, knowing you were being properly cared for." Their pitch was so smooth, so perfectly constructed, so full of the language of love and concern, that it was a work of art. They were framing my eviction as an act of profound filial devotion. They were selling my cage, and they were trying to convince me it was a palace. And then came the final closing move. Junior reached into the briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. He slid it across the table to rest beside the glossy brochure. "We've spoken to the administrators," he said, his voice now a low, confidential whisper, as if he were letting me in on a wonderful secret. "And we've spoken to our lawyer. We've brought the papers, Dad. Papers that would allow us to sell this house and use the proceeds to secure your place at Sunny Meadows for the rest of your life. It's all taken care of. All you have to do is sign." He tapped a gentle finger on the folder. "It's for the best." I let them finish. I let their proposal, in all its grotesque, greedy, and self-serving glory, hang in the air between us. I picked up the glossy brochure and looked at the smiling, happy seniors, at the perfect green lawn, at the beautiful, beige, and utterly soulless building. "Sunny Meadows," I said, a small, sad smile on my face. "It looks very beige." I then pushed their folder, their instrument of my dispossession, back towards the center of the table. I looked into their expectant, triumphant faces. "It's a very thorough and well thought out plan," I said, my voice as calm and as steady as a surgeon's hand. "But I'm afraid you're too late." The confidence on my daughter-in-law's face was a brilliant, hard, and ugly thing. She leaned back in her chair, a queen who had just successfully cornered her opponent, waiting for the final, satisfying move of his surrender. My son Junior, ever her loyal pawn, pushed the folder with the legal documents a final, encouraging inch across the table towards me. "Just sign it, Dad," he said, his voice a soft, cloying purr of false sympathy. "It's for the best. We can put all this behind us and make sure you're taken care of." I looked at their faces, so full of a smug, self-serving certainty, and I felt not anger, but a profound and weary sense of pity. They were so blinded by their own greed, so confident in my perceived weakness, that they had no idea they were the ones who had been outmaneuvered from the very beginning. My quiet line, "You're too late," hung in the air between us, a phrase so contrary to their expectations that for a moment they did not seem to understand it. Alicia was the first to recover, letting out a short, brittle laugh. "Too late for what, Samuel?" she asked, her tone condescending, as if speaking to a confused, senile old man. "Don't be dramatic. The papers are right here. Your new life is waiting. All it takes is a simple signature." "You are right, Alicia," I said, my voice as calm and as steady as a surgeon's hand. "This folder is indeed full of plans." I gently tapped the folder they had presented to me. "But my plans are already complete." I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate, and walked to the antique sideboard against the dining room wall. I retrieved the thin, unassuming manila folder I had placed there earlier and returned to the table. I did not sit. I stood at the head of the table, a position of authority in this house that I had not claimed in a very long time. I slid my own folder across the polished wood to meet theirs, a quiet, symbolic act of one legal document countering another. "You've both spoken at length about your concern for my well-being," I began, my gaze sweeping over their now confused faces. "And as you both know, Rose received the most wonderful and compassionate care in her final months from the nurses and volunteers at the Birmingham Cancer Support Foundation. She and I spoke at length about finding a way to repay that incredible kindness." I opened my folder. "So the day after the funeral, I had a meeting with my lawyer, Jonathan Davies, and I took care of my estate." I pulled out the first document and slid it across the table for them to see. "This," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, "is a legally executed and filed deed of gift. As of 9 o'clock in the morning, 2 days ago, I donated this house and the property it sits on in its entirety to the Rose Memorial Foundation, a new endowment I have established to be managed in perpetuity by the Cancer Support Foundation." I watched their faces as they processed the words. It was a slow, beautiful, and terrible thing to behold. I saw the initial flicker of utter, uncomprehending confusion. I saw that confusion give way to a dawning, sickening understanding. And I saw that understanding finally collapse into a mask of pure, pale, and horrified disbelief. Junior's mouth hung open, a silent, gaping O of shock. The color drained completely from Alicia's face, leaving her lipstick a stark, garish slash against her suddenly ashen skin. She was the first to find her voice, and it was a shrill, sputtering thing. "You can't do that," she shrieked, her carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. "This is our house, our inheritance. We'll fight this. We'll have you declared mentally incompetent. A judge will see that you're a grieving, confused old man who has been taken advantage of. Don't bother," I said, my voice still quiet, still calm. I reached into the folder and pulled out the second document. "I anticipated you might take that route. This is a physician's affidavit, signed and notarized by my personal doctor, Dr. Evans, also dated from 2 days ago. It attests, in no uncertain terms, to my perfect mental and cognitive competence to make my own legal and financial decisions." I let that sink in before delivering the final, crushing blow. "And this," I said, pointing to a specific, highlighted clause on the deed of gift, "is the part you might find most interesting. It's a legal instrument known as a retained life estate." I looked directly at Alicia, the woman who had so confidently planned to redevelop my property. "What that means, my dear, is that while the foundation is now the legal and irrevocable owner of this house, I, as the donor, retain the legally protected, absolute, and unchallengeable right to live in and use this property without interference for the remainder of my natural life. So you see, I said, my voice a soft, final, and devastating conclusion. I am not going anywhere. But more importantly, the house is no longer mine to sell, or for you to sell. It is, and will forever be, untouchable. The checkmate was absolute. I had built an ironclad legal fortress around my wife's legacy, and they were left standing outside the walls, disarmed, defeated, and utterly, completely powerless. Alicia was rigid with a silent, impotent fury. Her dreams of new construction and a bigger car turning to dust before her very eyes. And Junior, my son, finally put his head in his hands, a single broken sob escaping his lips, the sound of a weak man finally being crushed under the full, unbearable weight of his own greed. I stood up from the table, my duty to my wife, to my home, and to my own dignity, finally, blessedly, complete. Now, if you'll excuse me, I said, my voice no longer holding any trace of anger or even of sorrow. I have roses to tend to. I did not wait to watch the full spectacle of their defeat. I did not need to. I had delivered my final, decisive blow, and the outcome was no longer in question. I turned my back on them, on the two stunned, silent figures sitting at my dining room table amidst the ruins of their own greed, and I walked through the kitchen to the back door. I stepped out into the warm, late afternoon air of the garden, of Rose's garden, and I closed the door behind me, leaving them to suffocate in the vacuum of their own failed conspiracy. The garden was my sanctuary, the place where my wife's spirit was most alive. The air was thick with the sweet, heady perfume of her beloved roses, their deep red and soft pink blooms, a vibrant testament to the life and the love she had poured into this small patch of earth. I walked to the old, weathered wooden bench where she and I had spent so many quiet evenings, and I sat down. From here, I could hear the faint, muffled sounds from within the house. I heard a chair scrape harshly against the floor. I heard a brief, sharp, and ugly exchange of whispered, accusatory words. And then, a few minutes later, I heard the sound of the front door slamming shut with a petulant, angry force, followed by the sound of a car engine starting and tires squealing as it pulled away from the curb. And then there was silence, a profound, deep, and blessedly peaceful silence. The war was over, and I had won. But I felt no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of vengeful glee. I felt only a vast, quiet, and deeply cleansing sense of peace. The heavy, toxic burden of my sons and daughter-in-law's expectations, of their greed, of my own quiet, simmering resentment had been lifted from my shoulders. I was finally, truly alone in my own home. And for the first time since Rose had passed, it did not feel lonely. It felt free. I sat on that bench for a long time, watching as the sun began its slow, graceful descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. I thought about my son. I mourned him in that moment. Not the greedy, hollowed-out man who had just left my house, but the little boy I had once taught to ride a bike on this very lawn, the young man I had been so proud of on his graduation day. I mourned the loss of the man he could have been, the man his mother had always hoped he would become. I knew that in severing him from my will, I was likely severing him from my life. It was a grief as profound and as real as the one I felt for my wife, but it was a necessary grief, a surgical amputation, required to save the rest of my own soul from the gangrene of their bitterness. My duty was no longer to him. My duty was now to her, to Rose. I looked at the beautiful, defiant rose bushes she had so lovingly tended. "Well, Rosie," I whispered to a particularly beautiful, deep red bloom, its petals as soft as velvet. "I kept my promise. Our story is safe. The house is safe. The garden is safe. I won't let them touch it. Ever." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment I could almost feel her presence beside me on the bench, her hand in mine, her quiet, approving smile a balm on my weary heart. In the weeks that followed, I found a new, quiet rhythm to my life. I was no longer a grieving old man, a placeholder in my own home, waiting to be handled. I was a custodian, a guardian. I had a purpose. I woke up every morning and I tended to the garden, learning the names of all her plants, continuing the work she had started. I found, to my own surprise, that I had a good hand with them. Her roses thrived under my care. I began to volunteer, just a few hours a week, at the Cancer Support Foundation, the new official owners of my home. I did not tell them who I was. I was just Sam, the quiet old man who was good at fixing things, who could repair a leaky faucet or a broken chair. I would sit and play checkers with the patients, with the other husbands and wives who were navigating the same terrifying, heartbreaking journey I had just completed. I would listen to their stories, and sometimes I would share a small, quiet piece of my own. I was no longer an army medic, but I was, in my own small way, a healer again. I had lost a son, and the grief of that was a quiet, permanent ache that I knew would never truly go away. But I had gained something as well. I had gained a sense of peace so profound, so complete, that it was a revelation. I had learned that a home is not just a collection of wood and nails, an asset to be bought and sold. It is a living, breathing thing, a story written in the shared moments of a life. And I had learned that love, true love, is not about what you can get from someone, but about the promises you are willing to keep. I had kept my promise to Rose. I had protected our story. And in doing so, I had found my own final honorable peace.